And good afternoon to everybody from sunny Blacksburg, Virginia, where it's still fairly cold. I'll be moderating today's session by introducing our speaker and monitoring the questions to relay to Gary Felton to help answer any of the questions you may have. So today's topic is composting health and safety. The speaker, Gary Felton, will identify and describe the risk of potential health and safety issues for compost operators and explain how these risks can be reduced. So with no further ado, I'd like to welcome Gary Felton.
Welcome, everybody. I'm coming to you from College Park. I'm going to talk about a lot of things about safety. Several of the things I talk about you might think are common sense, but in order to get them done, you need to think about them more than just this next hour or so while I'm talking about them. So I may come back to that theme more than once. This material came by from a presentation that we've developed for the Mid-Atlantic Better Compost School, and the U.S. Composting Council operator training course has a topic outline, so I used the topic outline to develop this material. This is kind of where we're going, a roadmap of what we're going to talk about. I've tried my best to put health and safety in separate categories, but they don't really break out real cleanly. So here's the things that we'll talk about today. If you see anything there that you think ought to be there and isn't, I'm always open to suggestions. When we talk about health concerns, we might be talking about the environment around us, which is dust, the microbials. We definitely have noise in the compost business. Heavy equipment and machinery, not from the noise point of view, but from the getting run over point of view. And then there's an awful lot of things about heat. So that's kind of a coverage of where we're going with health concerns. When we look at dust, we have a couple of ways that it gets into our body, one by inhalation and the other as an eye irritant. The eye irritants are typically airborne, but not always. One of the things that we have most commonly with airborne contaminants is the possibility of a reaction to Aspergillus fumigatus, which is ubiquitous in compost and in forests. It's everywhere around us. We get microbial risks, which are a high concentration of bacteria and fungi we need for composting, but they also can react to people or people can react to them. Most human pathogens, like fecal coliforms, we get killed off by the high temperatures that we generate through composting. And when I say pathogen, that's just something that causes disease, and that could include parasites. But it's an infection-type invasion and the growth of something in the tissue. Inadequate composting can contribute to this, is if you don't get it hot enough, you're not killing the things that can be problems. E. coli 0157H7, which is one of the more pathogenic E. coli, is able to survive for a long time in the soil. A warning here, prions, which are just a convoluted protein, they're not really a bacteria, but they're not really an inanimate thing either. They're sort of something that we don't have a good classification for. They're not inactivated by the heat generated during composting. Typically, the findings for the few pieces of research we have say that their numbers are diminished, but that's different from being eliminated. If you're not familiar with prions, have you heard of chronic wasting disease in sheep? There's Jacob Creutzfeldt's disease, which is in humans, scrappy, mad cow disease in cattle. All these are done by basically the same prion. They're just a protein, but they seem to have a life. They're found in carcasses and meat processing. They're found particularly in the brain tissue and brain stem tissue of bovines. And so where we have animal carcasses in Maryland, if there's any suspicion that they've got prions in them, the only way they can be disposed of is by incineration at a Maryland Department of Agriculture facility. There are toxic and allergenic microorganisms. Most microbes in finished compost are found in our environment, most microbes get pretty well eliminated, and so the things that are left in finished compost have recolonized the compost. We also have some compost microorganisms that will simply insist in the compost, that is, get into a cyst, and then they'll break out of it when the temperature is right. We inhale these normal microorganisms all the time. Most of the time, it's not a problem. At high concentrations, it can be a problem. Repeated over or exposures can be a problem. And some people just have reactions to this type of microorganism. We have two main routes of exposure to compost. One is ingestion. It's the main route of infection. And that means what your mother told you, wash your hands. We get inhalation of bioaerosols, which is unlikely to cause infection most of the time, but it is a route for allergens and toxins. Anybody that's got a compromised immune system probably shouldn't be working in an active compost area. They need to go back in the office and do office work. Compost microorganisms can be aerosolized, that is, become part of the air that's floating around, and the shredding, turning, and screening operations do that fairly well for some things. Control of these bioaerosols is a pretty complex thing to do. What are some preventative measures for infections? Make sure you don't have mice, rats, vermin. Practice good hygiene. Keep the eating, drinking, and smoking away from the compost area. Wash your hands before you go into other clean areas so that you don't bring something in with you. Wear gloves when you're handling the feedstocks or the unfinished compost, because those can bring in lots of different microorganisms with them. You don't want to drink, eat, smoke on site except in those clean areas. And before you leave the site, change out of your clothes, leave them on the site, and wear clean clothes to and from work. Some of the preventive measures. We want to minimize the production of dust, and we do that several ways. One is by controlling moisture. We don't want it to get too dry. And of course, in the compost process, heat's generated. That creates water vapor, which takes moisture away from our compost. So it's a battle we have to fight to keep the moisture appropriate. We want to make sure that during screening, we get 40 to 60% moisture if we can. We want to wipe down hard surfaces and keep them clean. The last thing you want to do is dry sweeping of an area that's got dry compost on it. That's when we use compressed air when we clean things like backhoes and things like that. Wear dusk or a half dusk mask or a respirator whenever you're doing something in dusty areas. A lot of our equipment these days has got cabs with HEPA filters in them. That makes life a lot easier. You don't have to wear a mask while you're inside of a cab that might already be hot. Use filters or air conditioning in the cabs and keep the windows closed. Often you want to open up a window so you can hear people or so that you can see out the side better. Try to avoid that urge. Some health concerns other than the microorganisms. Noise is one of them. Hearing loss can occur. We have some very high-pitched sounds in the compost site. And so wear the ear protection that's around. Make sure you have ear protection. We'll talk about equipment just a little bit later, and personal protective equipment, of which hearing protection is some of it. Heat happens to us all. As we get older, we seem to be a little more sensitive to it, but a little bit of shade, a little bit of water is fairly important on a daily basis. Keep yourself well hydrated, because you're going to sweat on a compost site during the summer and even during the winter. So keep that water going. Make sure that you do on a regular basis, not just when you're feeling really thirsty. Safety, we call it common sense. It's also got to be a culture, and I'll come back to that a little bit later. But you want to make sure that safety is on your mind occasionally. This is a rather silly sign. Don't hold the wrong end of a chainsaw. But think about the equipment you're working with. A lot of that equipment has the same potential to do damage that a chainsaw does. maybe a little more potential than a chainsaw. So keep safety in mind when you're working around anything. Piles of compost is a safety concern too. But safety is good for business. If you got a safe environment, people that work there are happier. Safe environment allows workers to concentrate on what they're doing, what they need to get done, so the work turns out better. Nobody likes the thought of workers' compensation. You do have to have premiums, but you want to avoid having to use them, and you want to avoid equipment damage. Equipment damage can just shut you completely down until you get it taken care of. You definitely want to avoid unnecessary pain and illness or lost wages. That's bad for the worker, but unnecessary pain is bad for morale of people around you also. There are OSHA standards. They apply to composting mulching industry. Those OSHA standards can be found under their agriculture section and under their fertilizers in mixing. And that would be for when you mix compost with just about anything. On a site, you want to make sure that safety occurs lots of different ways, but you want to think about it every day. And I don't care if you're the worker, the manager, everybody on the site needs to think about safety. Everybody on the site contributes to safety. So you want to look at minimizing risk, personal safety, and equipment safety. 3 different areas of safety. Minimizing the risk means something that you got to look at the site for. It's like a prescription for a doctor. You've got to have the right site and the right equipment matched to that site. To minimize the risk, there's got to be personal protective equipment. There's a long list of that a little later on. You want good housekeeping program, which means vegetation management. Not the most fun thing to do on a site. Nobody likes to be the person that gets the weed eater in their hand, but that's got to be done. You want to avoid tripping hazards, not trip hazards. And you want to design for the extreme weather events. We've just had some very nice freezing weather followed by a little bit of snow. That makes everything slick. What are you going to do when that happens on your site? Think about what you're going to do to be careful. Think about what you're going to do to improve the conditions on the site before you have to do it. You don't want to come in Monday morning to 4 inches of snow and figure out, well, what do I do now? You want to have some plan in place so that you know what you do. There should be wind and fire breaks. We've had some discussions in Maryland about fire, about how wide the alleys should be between compost piles. You know that the closer the alleys are, the more compost we can put on a particular pad site. I would say that most compost sites that are successful would really like to have more space and be able to compost more. Well, the downside of that is if you have a fire on the far side of the compost and your piles are nice and close, no fire truck can get back there. So you have to think about how are you going to get a piece of fire equipment back into the back side of your compost site if you need to in a hurry. So ask the local fire department to come out and help you. Usually they're quite willing to come out and say, here's what we'd like to see. I don't think they usually come out with the here's what you're going to do kind of approach. I think that the county fire department has the right to do that, but that's probably going to vary from county to county. Know your feedstocks. Know their suppliers. That'll help you figure out what those feedstocks might carry with them. Ask your suppliers if they know anything that's in the contaminants that might be in the feedstock. Do they know about any microbes that commonly occur in their feedstock? We're going to talk about this written action plan for emergencies a little bit more, but have one written up so that you know what to do in an emergency that's common. What's a common emergency? Somebody falls off a piece of equipment. That's probably one of the most common ones. They just missed the step on the last step. You want to have an operations and maintenance manual for just about everything there individually, and then a site operations and maintenance manual. When we look at equipment, we want to have a fuel delivery and contaminant plan. What are we going to do to keep the fuel that we store on site from getting off site? Is there going to be structures such as you see in these pictures? Are we going to have processes that we can go through in case of an emergency? I was on one site where they had a huge pile of dirt piled next to a stream that went by the site, and they were ready to put that dirt into the stream to plug it up if they ever got a spill of something bad in there. Their concern was more of the stuff from their feedstocks, which was liquid, but they wanted to make sure they could plug that stream up in a hurry and treat that problem that they had. Personnel, the people involved. We want to see regular safety meetings. Everybody wants to see that. That makes it more of a culture. I'll say that word again. Safety is a culture that you have or that you neglect to put in place, one of the two. So regular safety meetings make it more of a culture. Have a monthly safety topic so that each meeting is different. Train the employees to recognize potential problems. Talk to your people. I'll get to that more formally a little bit later, but they're the people that see them probably before anyone else does. Make sure that your company has guidelines on injuries and then report those injuries. Provide the personal protective equipment like hard hats, safety shoes, vests. If you don't have those things, don't ask somebody to work when they don't have the safety equipment. Every piece of equipment comes with a safety manual, or at least a part of the operator's manual that talks about equipment safety. So make sure that you have that handy. Anytime you get a new piece of equipment, make sure that you're able to use that manual to educate everybody. Make sure everybody is educated on a new piece of equipment. And you may want to review some of the safety things periodically at some of your safety meetings. There are potential work area hazards, and those things are just about anything that pulls, moves weight. Almost everything on there can have some sort of safety issue. Even this fire extinguisher down there, if not mounted properly, can fall down and hurt somebody's foot or head. So make sure that you have that kind of potential work area hazards identified. You want to have everybody equipped with air filtration in places where they're going to need it. Do you have dust masks, simple dust masks? Do you have respirators where you need it? And we want to have lockout, tagout procedures. And it says for electrical components, but it's really more than that, not just electrical. You need to do lockout, tagout procedures for some of your hydraulics, water if it's used under high pressure. Lots of things need lockout, tagout procedures. And I'll get to those a little bit more as we go. What are you going to do about fires? Fires happen. The chemical equation for combustion is organic hydrocarbons, and that's pretty much what we use for our feedstocks. You add oxygen, and you get a reaction called oxidation, but we also call that flame. So carbon dioxide plus water plus heat plus carbon equals flame. Typical compost material ignite when the moisture gets low, or when there's compost material that has high moisture sitting right next to low moisture. If you get high moisture materials, that makes the microbes happy. The microbes go to work eating, and they generate heat. And if you have that low moisture material right next to it, you can end up creating a place where a fire can start. Usually, the larger the pile, the higher the pile, the higher the potential to get combustion. We call it spontaneous combustion. In Maryland, we're not allowed to pile anything higher than 12 feet. And the reason they cite for that, for the regulation, is that it's a fire hazard when organic matter gets higher than 12 feet high. I've seen some piles of manure that are probably 35 or 45 feet high. Fires occur when readily available fuel sources are configured in ways and an ignition source comes. That ignition source could be carelessness with a cigarette, as well as it could be spontaneous combustion. We get sparks, equipment, hot equipment. The underside of a piece of a mechanically powered equipment can get awful hot if that's where the exhaust is. We get the uncontrolled microbial activity that causes spontaneous combustion. And temperatures exceed, and look at these temperatures, somewhere between 160 and 175 degrees Fahrenheit, we can start to have chemical oxidation, which leads to spontaneous combustion. So it doesn't have to be hugely hot. It doesn't have to have a flame present to end up with a flame present. And no good safety talk is really any good unless you get to put some pictures of compost fires in there. They're not often a big problem when they're outdoors, unless the piles become too dry, if they're too large, and you can see the 12-foot number again. And large dry piles can spontaneously combust. The first one we had in Maryland was at a place called Dickerson, where they had stockpiled leaves about 35 feet high during the winter so that they could mix them with the grass clippings that came in later in the spring. And one of those piles simply got too hot and it took off burning. It started out with a smolder. When the fire department came in, they broke open the pile to get to it, and it turned into about a 175-foot high flame at that point. So here's some, I guess I should call these rules of thumb. There'll be exceptions to lots of them. But meet with your local fire department. They'll be glad to come out to your site most times and discuss and agree on guidelines. And one of their particular peeves is to make sure that there's good access roads. Think about being able to get a fire truck back everywhere on your site. You should have proper equipment on site also. That means you need some front-end loaders around, even if you don't need them for much else, although we need them for almost everything. Make sure the piles are adequately ventilated, and make sure that you can keep them low enough so that you don't get the potential for fires. We call these things vents when they start smoldering down deep in the pile. We've just talked about two fire situations here recently. One was a house of laying hens, where the manure came out on a belt, dropped about 35 feet down, and they allowed that to pile up to over 20 feet high. And the people that were doing this noticed that they were getting areas of basically charcoaled manure about 12 foot deep in their piles, and it was completely dry where the rest of the manure was pretty moist. They thought they might have a problem there, and they did see smoke out of some of them. So that's what it is when it's a vent. It's something that starts deep and comes up almost like making its own chimney. For mulch piles in Maryland, mulch piles are required to have their temperature taken with a infrared thermometer on a weekly basis, and those temperatures need to be recorded so that they can see how temperatures are changing on piles. It's not required on compost sites, but it is on mulch sites. We say locate a fire and open it with a front end loader. Take that with a grain of salt. If you see smoke and you open something with a front end loader, you are probably adding oxygen to the fire. That can result in an instant flare-up. You need to be able to get that front end loader out of there. You don't want to be stuck on that loader and not be able to get out of where you get into. So if you're going to open something up, be careful about it. You want to water the fire embers, so you need to have something that you can water with. And smoking should be way far away from all of our materials. This is one of those nice fires that I get to show pictures of. The city of Durham, North Carolina, in September 2006. It cost $36,000 to put up the fire and clean up. Took 3 weeks to put this fire out. This was an active compost site. Compost sites do catch fire, normally because of the storage of your basic feedstocks, not so much in the active compost area itself. Other types of injury and risk. We call them musculoskeletal injury, and that's from doing something to your body. Falls from ladders are at the top of the list. Slipping on spilled materials ranks up there. Contact with moving parts. Remember, we have screens that can move very fast and do a lot of damage in a hurry if you're in the wrong place. I haven't heard too much about people getting tangled up in a compost turner. That's a possibility, but it doesn't seem to happen a whole lot yet. Trauma or death, injury due to ejection of foreign matter. When we're doing windrow turning, you don't want to be behind that turner anywhere near behind it because it can throw things out the back. And of course, we have machinery. Machinery makes noise, and noise can cause hearing loss if you don't have hearing protection. Most of our equipment comes with safety guards. Frequently, those safety guards seem to disappear. We really want those safety guards to stay in place. If there's an accident and the safety guard is out of place, you're asking for liability issues there. If the safety guard is in place, you've got a much better defense of we were doing our best to take care of things. Sometimes guards are removed to clear blockages or maintenance. That process has to be done carefully, and the guards have to go back on as soon as you're done clearing things. Failure to what we call isolate machine adequately when clearing blockage. We talk about that mostly in the terms of lockout and tagout, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute or two. And then we also have simple falls occurring during cleaning and maintenance. But these are injuries that can occur and frequently do occur. Can't remember which slide it is, but I'll show you what OSHA finds as the most frequent injuries. Compost is an aerobic process. Aerobic processes do not generate H2S. But we do have confined spaces. And when we get confined spaces, we can have a lack of oxygen, and that can end up generating H2S because our organic matter doesn't always stay where we put it. To get a confined space, it has to be something that's large enough and configured in a way that you can get in it and perform work. It has limited openings for entry and exit, and it's not designed to be occupied all the time. Those things together constitute a confined space. Now, there's some things that are confined spaces that you may not think about. If you think about the tank on a water truck, yeah, that qualifies as a confined space. It is confined. You're not supposed to be in it all the time, and it's large enough. Other common characteristics of confined space are that the ventilation isn't good enough to remove air contamination. Access for removal of somebody in a confined space is usually difficult, either due to the location or the size of the openings. And don't forget, removal of somebody is not a simple process. If you have somebody that weighs 180 pounds and they're down in a hole, it's not going to be easy to get them out of there. One of the confined spaces that we have that we often don't think about is our drainage network of sewer pipes if we have subsurface drainages. And these are great places for hydrogen sulfide to develop in a sewer system because that sewer's got organic matter from our compost operation in it. It's got a limited amount of oxygen and it has moisture. And that's what you need to generate H2S. Basically, you're undergoing anaerobic digestion with a source that has sulfur in it. Any confined space that's enclosed or partially enclosed and is big enough for a worker to enter becomes a problem. It's not designed to work in regularly, but people have to enter these spaces. So think about these spaces in terms of how do you get into them, clean them, maintain them, and get out of them, and do repairs if you have to. You've entered a confined space just putting your head across the plane of the opening. There was a case where a man stuck his head in a tank to see what the level was, and that's where he died from inhaling hydrogen sulfide just by sticking his head in the top of a tank to see where the fluid level was. This is California compost site. You can see the entrance to the sewer right there, and 2 people died in that when they went down in the sewer to try to clear the clog that occurred in it. This is a different location, a mushroom facility up in British Columbia. It looks like a tin shed, and you might not always think of it as a confined space, but it housed inside of it a pump that took water from a condensate or a effluent collection system and moved the water. Well, that pump right at the flange above the pump clogged up. Ended up with 3 dead people working in it, or 3 dead people from trying to rescue other people, and 2 more were disabled from being overcome by H2S. This is just a front view down here at the bottom. It looks just like a shed with a door in it. In fact, that's what it was, but it constituted a confined space. So here's a list of confined spaces. Look at these and see if some of those might surprise you. A boiler, yeah, I guess that's a confined space. Vats definitely are. Vaults, silos, sumps, water reservoirs, all of these are confined spaces. They all meet the definition, and they all have the potential of having dangerous gases. We do 3 things we create 3 dangerous gases. The most commonly thought of one is methane. Methane comes from anaerobic digestion. It's the major gas in terms of volume that's supplied, and it basically can suffocate somebody because it'll take the place and displace oxygen. We get H2S, and then the other thing that's generated from anaerobic digestion is CO2. So those 3 gases are the major gases, and another one that may be is ammonia. Those things are generated when organic matter, water, and lack of oxygen get together. In terms of OSHA, confined spaces require some signage and some preparation. OSHA is glad to help. They will do outreach assistance to you for compliance. They'll help you figure out laws and regulations. They also do enforcement. Most of them have state programs. If you go to the OSHA site here on your screen, you can find a frequently asked questions section, and they have electronic tools that can help you. So you can get some help from OSHA in making your site safer. A lot of it, you sit in front of a computer and say, that doesn't apply to me, that doesn't apply to me, oh, I didn't think about that. And that you can end up, having a head start on it before you ask for assistance to somebody to visit. I mentioned this before, lockout tagout procedure. A lockout is locking power off, some device to keep power from being turned on. Perhaps you've seen some of the switches that have a handle that you throw up or down, and they have a place where you can put a padlock through them to keep them in the on or the off position. Tag out means putting a tag over the switches, the valves, the handles, or anything else that can turn power on. Power doesn't mean just electricity. It's some sort of hazardous energy. And of course it includes electricity, but there's also mechanical power, hydraulic power, pneumatic power, chemical, thermal, and other power sources, and they're all in a lot of the equipment we use. When you service and maintain machines, unexpected startup or release of stored energy can be serious. It can kill people. Something we don't often think about, particularly in older machines that run on hydraulic oil as part of their function. If you have a bucket of something that's raised up in the air and it's an older machine, if somebody pulls a lever just by getting up into the seat and accidentally grabs something, a bucket that's up in the air can come down, and that bucket has a lot of force, can be very harmful to people. And that's why we talk about lockout rather than just putting a sign on it, because when you get in and out of something, you can grab something by accident. What are the harmful effects of hazardous energy? Well, dead. Dead is the most serious one we think about. But workers are servicing or maintaining equipment can get hurt in all sorts of ways if the energy isn't controlled. And it includes electrocution, but it also includes burns, crushing, cutting, lacerating, amputating, fractures, and lots of things. Here's some examples of them. A jam conveyor system releases. There's weight on that conveyor, and it goes moving and crushes someone trying to clear a jam. Well, it was jammed, so it was stopped, but if it wasn't locked out so that it couldn't move, someone could get hurt. Internal wiring on a piece of equipment shorts, and that can shock a worker who's trying to repair it or maybe just analyze it to see what the problem is. Some valves, like steam valves, are automatically turned on and off. And if you're working on something and the time comes and there's a switch sent to that valve, if that valve isn't turned off, locked out in other words, it can burn somebody who's working on something in that piping system. So we need to think about preventive measures for injuries. You want to become familiar with and follow the OSHA requirements. And those are not just equipment specific, but equipment specific is where you have to start. You want to make sure that your equipment is isolated from the energy source. It's locked out and tagged out. You want to do that by disconnecting electricity physically so that someone would have to pick it up and plug it in. You might want to remove an extension cord if that's what connects it. You might want to lock a switch off. You want to guard moving parts on screens and things like that. Leave the guards in place. Don't take them apart when you're working on them unless you absolutely have to. If it's a raised platform, it should be railed so that you have railings and steps to get up to that raised platform. Ladders to get to a raised platform just aren't a good idea. Sooner or later, that ladder is going to slip or fall. Whenever we're working amongst a bunch of things, and I think of pallets when I think of this, we have a lot of compost that's put on pallets and sometimes stacked high. You want to keep the aisles and the passageways between pallets clear. You want to identify potential work area hazards. That means getting people to walk around with you. You walk around with them, the people that work there, and talk to them about what the potential work area hazards might be. You need to label the pinch points, that is, points where things back up, belts, chains, moving parts, places where things are thrown. Remember, we use screening, which throws the compost. Well, it throws anything else that gets in there too. We want to have plenty of fire extinguishers around. Fire extinguishers require a tiny bit of maintenance. Most of them have a green zone and a red zone with an arrow on it. You want to make sure that your fire extinguishers are in the green zone, meaning that they're charged appropriately. When they get to the red zone with the arrow pointing to the red, means they may not have the charge left to propel the fire suppressing materials in it. When we talk about personal protective equipment, we can get a pretty good list. The first 3/4 of this list is pretty obvious. Steel-toed boots, long pants. As hot as it gets in the summer, you still want long pants on a compost site. Gloves, dust protection, hearing protection, vests, hard hats, and eye protection. But there's other things that you may not think about. They're a little more subtle. They're a little more specialized. You may not use them every day. And you may have an unexpected need for them. If you have these confined spaces, personal breathing apparatus is something that can save lives. You may never use it if you're lucky, but if you have a need of it, you can't go out and get it when that need occurs. Someone will die if it's not there and handy. What's personal breathing apparatus? Pretty much it's a scuba tank and a mouthpiece. That's the kind of breathing apparatus you typically want available, because if somebody goes down in a confined space, you almost need that personal breathing apparatus to get in, tie something to them, and get them out. Another thing that is done when going into some of these confined spaces is to go in with a full body harness on and be roped off to something outside the confined space. You might also want to think about personal hydrogen sulfide monitors. They're not the cheapest thing in the world. They can be $100 to $500 for just an H2S monitor, or maybe up to $1,000 or more for a multiple gas monitor. But there probably ought to be an H2S monitor on the site if you have a confined space that people are going to be getting into more than once. I guess even once, because you want somebody to be able to wear that monitor into that confined space. OSHA had a list of the most frequently cited problems, and it says during last year, but that should be during 2014. The first most cited problem was abrasive wheel machinery, grinders such as that. We don't really have abrasive wheel machinery except in our machine shops, if we have grinders there. Mechanical power transmission apparatus, well, that defines pretty much every piece of mobile equipment on our site. Poor hazard communication, guarding floor and wall openings, having that sewer that I showed you earlier that had just an opening as opposed to a grate over it. That's not guarding a floor opening. And general requirements not being met for all machines. The top two things that gave fines were the control of hazardous energy, failure to do lockout tagout procedures, and mechanical power transmission apparatus, which is a lot of the things we have. It's more than just the transmission that we think of when we think of transmitting power in a machine. It's more than just that little part that's called transmission. We recommend that you do something called job hazard analysis. Job hazard analysis is a formal process. It indicates to a lot of people that you've taken some time to think about it. You've probably got as much input as is possible. So the process is to involve your employees in the hazard analysis. Discuss with your employees the hazards they know exist in their current work area and surroundings. If you can identify a hazard, you can probably develop a way to improve the conditions. Oh yeah, ask them about ideas to improve conditions, to eliminate or control these hazards. The people working around them are the people that probably are going to know one idea at least to get rid of these hazards. You walk the site together, discuss close calls they've had, something that almost happened. Discuss the hazards. What are the solutions to those hazards? And you may want to do this on a regular basis, say once a year or twice a year. You need to decide if you need annual, twice a year, or any other appropriate frequency for this. Maybe you should do one first before you decide if you need annual or twice a year or anything else. But do this job hazard analysis. Each of the guys you work with is going to have slightly different jobs, so you need to keep that in mind and add that into your job hazard analysis. OSHA wants you to have a facility safety operations manual, a formal document created at the facility, for the facility, and by the facility employees. So it's like a doctor's prescription. It's a prescription to keep this site safe. The hazard analysis process that I just talked about puts the details for all of these things into that manual. But it's a living document. It's not something you do once, put on a shelf, and forget. It's something that you're going to pull out and review periodically, and it's something you're going to update. Now, if there's an accident, OSHA will probably ask for that. So if you have one, That's several strikes against you that didn't happen. If you don't have one, they're going to think you're not running a safe site, and they'll be looking for everything they can. I don't know if you've ever heard the term feeding frenzy, but when something goes wrong, regulators tend to look at it with a fine-tooth comb. I call it a feeding frenzy, where they look at things in great detail. And that's probably not inappropriate. But if you have some of these things in place, there's a little more comfort from the regulator's side that maybe things are done pretty well here. This is a facility safety operations manual table of contents. And it's just an example. This website there shows you where the whole write-up on this manual is. And the table of contents for this manual could look like, doesn't have to look like, but could look like, what is the accident prevention program? What are the vehicle operation safety policies? How do we do lockout and tag out? What personal protective equipment is in use? Where is it stored? How do we get to it? What is the accident reporting policy in this particular site? How do we control pathogens? Where do we have breathing protection, hearing protection, confined spaces? Do we have them? If so, what have we decided to do about them? What do we do to protect against falls? What all have we done in the past? And we have chemical, heat, outdoor heat, first aid. Those are the table of contents of a manual. Yours may have different things in them. Make sure that within this manual is an area called MSDS sheets, the material safety and data sheets. Every material you bring in should have one of these. Of course, your feedstocks will never have them, but you ought to know what's in your feedstock, so you might have a set behind your MSDS sheets of analyses of your feedstocks. Finally, and in closing, safety is a culture. It's something that you develop, and it comes from the top down. If you, the people that are involved in the management, talk about safety, think about safety, there's a better chance that those that work with you and for you will think about safety, talk about safety, and be safe every day and think about that. It's a culture that you have to foster, but it's a culture that everybody can get a hold of. And with that, we'll kind of close and ask Greg if he's seen anything exciting.
So far, I've not seen any questions come along, Gary. Thanks for that presentation. Of all the topics that we typically discuss during the year in this kind of a webinar or at our actual field school, the health and safety don't normally seem to be a topic that elicits a lot of interest at the beginning, but anyone who listens can certainly see or certainly hear the value in understanding health and safety at the site. So I'm sort of rambling on as hopefully our participants might be thinking about what they've heard, about any questions that they might have for you. Of course, you will always be available to them to contact after the webinar if they think of something later. But in the interim, we're just still monitoring Q&A and
one of the things I do want to say is every year I hear about a compost accident somewhere in either Canada or the US where somebody loses a limb or where somebody is killed. It happens every year. Please do your best to avoid having it happen to you by thinking about safety and doing something about it.
So as it appears that we don't have any questions for Gary for today's presentation, we will, something popped up. So one of our listeners asked about the 12-foot high pile. They said that she's seen dry stack raw manure and bedding piles higher than 12 feet, and asked if this in itself could be a fire risk.
I will put the adjective potential in front of it, and it is a potential fire risk, without a doubt. We see that in litter, or manure from chickens, and I've measured temperatures in there. So we do have hot piles of manure at 20 feet high that are a fire hazard. I went out to a site where they had just lost an entire chicken house to a fire, and they weren't sure why it started. Well, they had smoke coming out of some of their other chicken houses in the piles of manure they had there because they were smoldering. So yeah, a high pile of manure is a fire hazard, or at least a potential.
Yeah, and we've also heard of bales of hay that spontaneously can spontaneously combust that aren't the pranks, that actually may have spontaneous combustion. Let's see, another question. Can you share any specific examples of amputations and root causes? So
I don't remember all the details of an amputation that occurred in California just last year. There was a worker in a compost site that lost an arm, but I can't remember the details of why he lost his arm. I don't know what equipment he was working on. I do remember that he was clearing a jam of something. I don't know if it's jam of raw material or just a mechanical jam in the equipment.
Yeah, we often hear of similar accidents around chippers, and chippers may or may not be actually at the compost site. They may be used by municipalities in preparing material to deliver to compost sites, but chippers also are a potential source. People getting twisted up in branches as they're pulled into this equipment, and I've heard of some people losing some limbs in that way. So let's see, every time I'm about to close, thankfully we have someone from the audience. So
okay, I can answer that one.
Yeah, okay.
That one is difficult. Fire department policy almost everywhere is to open up the pile so that you can get water to it. But when you open it up, our experience has been that there's a flare-up. The other option is to water it some more. And so it may take days of watering it, but you can get that done without a flare-up. Most fire departments will go ahead and open it. That happened out at the Dickerson site. My understanding is the operator there told them, don't open that, you're going to get it just blowing up in your face. And they did open it, and that's what happened. So you may have the idea of how to do it without a flare-up, but the fire department may have a different point of view. When a fire department is on site, they are in control. They get to make all the decisions, even if they're wrong.
Okay, so I'd say with that, we'll probably wrap up today's webinar. Remember that within a week or two, we'll have the recording of this online, and we'll soon have an announcement for our next webinar, which will be webinar number 9 in the 12-part series coming up in February. That'll be on regulations. We've got a specialist from the Solid Waste Division of DEQ in Virginia who will address Composting regulations in general she'll be using some Virginia examples, but I think even to people outside of Virginia, her list of the main kinds of regulations that are typically ignored will be interesting. And Gary, I think, will be presenting from a Maryland perspective also. So with that, I'd like to thank all participants and hope you have a great weekend.